The last carrier battle of the Pacific War refers to the Battle of the Philippine Sea, which occurred between June 19 and June 20, 1944. This battle, fought during the larger campaign to secure the Mariana Islands, was a decisive conflict between the United States Navy and the Imperial Japanese Navy that would ultimately signal the end of Japan's ability to conduct significant naval operations in the Pacific. This engagement marked the last major carrier-based battle in the Pacific theater and was a turning point that led to the collapse of Japan's naval power. Strategic importance of the battle. By mid-1944, the United States had gained momentum in the Pacific, advancing through the Solomon Islands, the Gilbert Islands and the Marshall Islands, making steady progress toward Japan's remaining strongholds. The capture of Saipan in the Marianas Islands was a key strategic objective, as it would place U.S. forces within striking range of Japan itself, particularly for the new B-29 Superfortress bombers that could launch long-range air raids. To prevent this, the Japanese had to stop the American advance and defend their outer perimeter in the Pacific. The Japanese command, realizing that losing Saipan would mean a severe strategic setback, decided to commit what remained of their carrier force to a desperate attempt to repel the U.S. advance. The stage was set for the Battle of the Philippine Sea, a pivotal carrier battle that would see the Japanese fleet attempt to stop the American advance by launching an all-out assault on U.S. forces. Forces and commanders. The U.S. Navy, under the command of Admiral Raymond Spruance, was determined to secure the Marianas and neutralize the Japanese threat. The Americans had a substantial carrier force, including the USS Enterprise, USS Yorktown, and USS Lexington, supported by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The U.S. forces were also supported by land-based aircraft from the newly established airfields on Saipan, providing significant air superiority. The Japanese, commanded by Admiral Somu Toyota, assembled a formidable fleet in an attempt to defend the Marianas. The Japanese force consisted of 4 carriers: the Shokaku, Zuho, Junyo, and Chuyo, along with a series of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The Japanese hoped to launch an overwhelming strike against U.S. forces and sink as many American carriers as possible. However, their strength was increasingly diminished after years of fighting and the loss of numerous aircraft and experienced pilots. The battle. The Battle of the Philippine Sea began on June 19, 1944, when the U.S. Navy, having located the Japanese fleet, launched a series of attacks. The Japanese fleet was intercepted by American aircraft launched from the carriers, and U.S. pilots engaged in intense aerial combat with the Japanese. One of the most significant aspects of the battle was the Japanese reliance on conventional pre-war tactics and poor intelligence. The Japanese underestimated the effectiveness of U.S. air superiority and failed to anticipate the scale of the American response. As a result, the Japanese launched a series of poorly coordinated and ineffective attacks against U.S. carriers, which ultimately led to disastrous losses. One of the defining moments of the battle was the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a term coined by American pilots to describe the overwhelming slaughter of Japanese aircraft. U.S. fighter pilots, flying F-6F Hellcats, intercepted waves of Japanese bombers and fighters, shooting down over 300 Japanese planes with minimal American losses. The F-6F Hellcat proved to be a dominant fighter, capable of outmaneuvering and outgunning its Japanese counterparts, including the Mitsubishi A6M0. While U.S. aircraft were decimating the Japanese air forces, U.S. carrier-based bombers and torpedo planes were also attacking the Japanese carriers. The U.S. Navy succeeded in sinking 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers, including the Shokaku, Zuho, and Junyo, while the 4th, the Chuyo, was heavily damaged but not sunk. Aftermath and impact. The consequences of the Battle of the Philippine Sea were profound. The Japanese Navy, which had relied on its aircraft carriers as the core of its naval strength, was left without the ability to launch effective carrier operations. The loss of 4 carriers and over 400 aircraft crippled Japan's naval aviation capabilities, and the damage to the Japanese fleet would never be fully repaired. For the United States, the battle was a decisive victory. The U.S. Navy had not only destroyed much of the Japanese carrier force but also demonstrated its overwhelming superiority in carrier-based warfare. The American victory allowed for the successful invasion and capture of the Marianas Islands, including Saipan, which paved the way for the use of B-29 bombers to strike the Japanese home islands. The battle also marked the beginning of the end for Japan's offensive capabilities in the Pacific. While Japan would continue to fight for another year, the loss of its carriers and experienced pilots left the Japanese fleet in a state of near-permanent defensive retreat. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was the last major carrier battle of World War II, and it represented a final blow to Japan's naval ambitions in the Pacific. Legacy. The Battle of the Philippine Sea remains one of the most significant and decisive battles of the Pacific War. It showcased the growing superiority of U.S. naval and air forces, particularly the effectiveness of American carriers and the Hellcat fighter. The battle also highlighted the changing nature of naval warfare, as the aircraft carrier had definitively replaced the battleship as the primary naval weapon. With the Japanese Navy crippled and unable to recover, the Battle of the Philippine Sea signaled the collapse of Japan's naval power and set the stage for the final Allied victories in the Pacific. It paved the way for the subsequent liberation of the Philippines, the assault on Iwo Jima, and the eventual invasion of Okinawa, culminating in Japan's surrender in 1945. In the broader context of the Pacific War, the Battle of the Philippine Sea represented the last major carrier conflict before Japan's defeat, cementing U.S. dominance in the Pacific and further isolating Japan from its resources in Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands.